Good morning. I'd like to call to order our city's budget committee meeting today. With me on the dais is my Vice Chair Steve Fletcher, Councilmember Steve Fletcher. We're also joined by Councilmembers Reich and Schrader, and I know that there are others because I see people's stuff filtering up here that will join us as we move along. But just to start, because we have a lot of information that we want to cover, the point of today is just part 2 of long-range budget projections and receiving that information from our budget director, Micah Intermill. So without further ado, I will just turn it over to him. Oh, and thank you for joining us, Councilmember Bender.
Great. Madam Chair and members, thank you for having me back. We had a great, robust conversation, I thought, a few weeks ago, and that really focused on what's included in the mayor's recommended budget, specifically for next year. And so this presentation, I thought, I'd take some time and walk you through how those decisions for next year play out in terms of the longer range financial impacts for the city.
Thank you. And just as you start, I want to just remind my colleagues, I think we had some really good conversation in the first budget meeting, and I welcome you in inviting questions as he goes along and making this more conversational in nature. So thank you. Thanks for joining us, council members Warsami and Cunningham.
Great, thank you. So just off the bat, the reason that we're talking about this, I think it's easy to lose sight of the long range when we're in year-to-year budgeting. In the 650-page budget document that we have, right off the bat, we talk about the city budgeting principles, and the first 2 of those really speak to what's important and what we need to be considering, you all as a council, as well as the mayor, in putting together the city's budget. And so that talks about securing the city's long-term financial health, thinking about decisions with a multi-year outlook, and balancing across funds. I think in the city's history, we've had some deficit years in funds, and so looking at things with the long range helps to prevent against those deficit situations, and then also living within our means. So thinking about the revenues before we think about what it is that we want to spend. And so all of that really does then funnel to the 5-year financial direction for the general fund, as well as, so section E of the budget book really includes that financial plan, as well as plans for all of our internal service funds and our enterprise funds, thinking about that 5-year time horizon. So if you look, if you happen to have your budget books with you, and I believe a number of you do, on page E7 of that document, there's a numbers-rich page that can be a little bit intimidating. So what I'd like to do is walk through that 5-year financial direction line by line to help you understand not only what makes up those lines, but also what the assumptions are behind them. I think it's important to note that not only are the policy decisions that you're making day to day impacting these numbers, but also when you're setting the 5-year financial direction and adopting it with the budget at year end, you'll have an opportunity to foreshadow some of those policy choices. So the first category that's listed is franchise fees, and these are fees that are assessed as a percentage of gas, electric, and cable bills. We assume a 1% increase per year for this category, and our revenues are affected by not only what the rate is that we charge as a percentage of each bill, but also the size of the bills themselves. And so that percent per year really is assuming that over time the rate that's assessed as a percentage won't necessarily change, but the bills themselves will grow. I think when thinking about franchise fees, a lot of folks look to the gas and electric portion, and certainly last year council adopted an increase to the gas and electric franchise fees, but also there are those same fees assessed to cable. As it's 2018 and we go into different types of media with high-speed fiber and cord cutting that occurs in many households, mine included, I think we may see a bit of a decline in that cable TV revenue.
I do just want to point out for those of us that don't have the budget book handy or who want to just always have the budget book online and get used to where to look at it, Casey Carl just sent us all an email that brings you directly to the budget link, so you can go right to that page that Micah spoke about.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And for folks who may be watching at home, it's a good opportunity to remind them that they can access the city's budget documents not only from the homepage of minneapolismn.gov, but they can also go to minneapolismn.gov/budget. So no questions on franchise fees. We'll move to licenses and permits, which we had some discussion about a few weeks ago when referencing the fact that we had seen an increase to license fees. We will see one in 2019. About roughly 60% of the license and permit revenue comes from construction permits that, we're in our sixth year, or 2017 was our sixth year of billion-dollar construction. The economy continues to go gangbusters. I think as we, from a bit of a conservative take on making sure that we're not planning on revenues that as the economy slows, we'll see slowed construction. We do include a taper to these fees beginning in 2021. And so within the $47 to $48 million number that you're seeing, we do reduce the assumption on construction permits beginning in 2021 by $1 million, and then $500,000 each year thereafter. So licenses and permits collect revenues associated with our regulatory activity. Charges for services are more optional things that folks engage the city, folks reach out to the city for. So utility cuts and connections is a category that you see here, development and loan origination as well. But the largest portion you see here in charges for services is overhead that we charge from the general fund to other funds. And so when you think about, and that's for activity that the general fund provides on behalf of those other funds. So thinking about the finance activity, it's fully funded by the general fund, but certainly there's benefit to the utility operations. And so those pay back into the general fund an amount that helps to defray those costs for property taxpayers. Excuse me. So the next category that you see on your 5-year financial direction is fines and forfeits, and this is much as it sounds, fine and citation revenue that is assessed to those who incur those penalties. Again, it's a minimal 1% per year increase is assumed. We actually are seeing less fine and forfeit revenue in the general fund than we did several years ago. And that's associated with the introduction of parking meters that can be paid via credit card. There's a lot more voluntary participation in paying for your parking, and so we see less fine revenue as a result. And so I think that's a really good example of a policy change where, and I wasn't at the city at the time, so I'm not sure if it was specifically the council directing Public Works or Public Works taking the initiative on their own, but that action had a direct impact then on the city's financial position. And as all of these general fund revenues are not dedicated to a specific department, then it's important to recognize we have to recover that revenue somewhere else.
Mr. Intramural, could you just, fines versus citations, I just want to press on the difference between those two a little bit. Could you just give us a few more sentences about that?
Madam Chair, that is a great question, and there are many gradations of different revenue categories that we have within our chart of accounts, and I'm not familiar with each one. I'm looking to see if anybody in the audience may be, and I'm seeing no volunteers, but we can certainly get back to you with an answer on that.
Thank you.
I'm sure that there is a logical difference between the two as defined by GAAP, but I just don't know it off the top of my head. So the next category you see is special assessments, and this is revenues from collected from properties which receive the primary benefit of the service. And so the largest category there of street maintenance is, folks are very familiar. This is actually the street in front of my house was resurfaced this summer, and it looks great. And I will be seeing an assessment on my property tax bill to pay for some of that service. And so the philosophy here is those who are most directly benefiting from the service pay for it through a property tax assessment. The unpaid administrative citations there, it relates to some of the work that's done through our regulatory services department. So as they engaged with it was formerly known as the problem properties unit, working with landlords on cutting grass and things of that nature. If citations aren't paid within a period of time, then they get tacked on to as a property tax assessment to your property tax bill.
Let me pause you there for a second. Council Vice President Jenkins has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to clarify, you mentioned those who benefit the most pay for it, and I want to clarify they pay a percentage of it, right? Not because we are broadcasting this to the public, and so the public, those who benefit don't pay the entire cost.
Madam Chair, Vice President Jenkins, I think it would depend on each individual charge. There may be some charges for which the full cost is sent to, is recovered through special assessments as opposed to the general property tax levy. So we do, in the case of street assessments, we do levy for bond redemption. So when we borrow to do construction, some of it then is paid directly via property tax revenues, but then we also, in our capital planning, also assume some of it will be paid by special assessments, if that helps.
I just want to interject here and say, we often think of streets in terms of special assessments, but a lot of special assessments are things that residents can petition into, right? So whether it's a special service district of property owners in a commercial area that want to band together and pay for a benefit, or whether it's something that that has happened in the past, or when residents band together and they want their own street level lighting, they can assess in when we don't already do that as a city on their street. Speed humps has been another one in the past that we have allowed neighbors to petition into and then pay for entirely themselves. So special assessments covers more than just streets, but streets is on our mind because it's what we do so much, and it's what so much of the revenue goes toward.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very well said. So we spoke at length about local government aid last time I was here, and it's a very healthy portion of our city's general fund budget. 82% of what we receive from the state is local government aid into the general fund, but then we also do receive a number of other aids, such as aid for our pensions. Those are for our current pensions, not the closed pension fund, closed pension funds, but offsetting some of the police and fire pension costs that we incur as an employer. And then also that municipal state aid is a program that the state has working with cities to maintain city roads. We assume that these revenues will be flat. This is an area that we don't have direct control over at the city, though we do certainly have an ability to influence the state. And so this is an area where the more dollars and time that we spend lobbying at the state capitol, then that's a policy decision that can influence up or down our state aid revenues. And so just again, something to keep in mind, though it is important for me to note that we do assume a flat growth just from a conservative budgeting standpoint. Our interest earnings I also talked about a few weeks ago, and in that though they are higher this year, and we're expecting higher returns in 2019 than we have seen in previous years. For the 2018 budget, we had budgeted $3 million in interest earnings. Since then, we've seen a number of increases to interest rates from the Fed in Washington, D.C., and so really that's the primary driver of these additional interest earnings. For 2019, we are expecting to see a $6 million amount for interest earnings, but then in our 5-year financial direction, our long-range planning, again, from a place of fiscal conservatism, we're expecting to see that go back down. Now, if we do see, if we have revenues in excess of $4 million, then those dollars will fall to the bottom line of the general fund. And so they'll be available for use for one-time items or merely to support the contingency, that sort of rainy day fund that we hold in the general fund. But from a standpoint of planning for what we can pay for in the future, we do recognize that eventually the economy will change. We may see another reduction in interest rates. So then the last line you see, or one of the last lines that you see in the 5-year financial direction is other miscellaneous revenues, which is always a scary category. And this is just various small amounts from across the enterprise, different functions that we perform that don't neatly fall from a chart of accounts standpoint into the other activities that we perform. I think maybe one of the items that stands out on that pie chart is county state aid. And so similar to the municipal state aid that we receive for working on city roads, if we do work on county roads, we have an agreement where then we receive those state funds for county work.
Mr. Intramural, there's a couple of questions or comments here. First is Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just curious if we can go back to the previous slide. We have it anticipated as flat around $4 million, but for 2019 we have it at $6 million, and I'm wondering what's special about 2019. Why are we making a lot more money on interest than what we're projecting into the future?
So, Madam Chair, Councilmember Fletcher, I think that's so. What's special about 2019 is we have more certainty around, and I'll say more certainty, not absolute certainty, around what will happen. And so recognizing where interest rates are now, and not, we don't have economists on staff here at the city, though we do engage some outside investment partners. We're comfortable projecting that $6 million revenue figure for 2019. We're just not comfortable expecting that level to continue out beginning in 2020 and beyond.
Thank you. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm curious about what is in our portfolio. What are we investing in? What does this include? I didn't think we had very many big investments.
Madam Chair, Council Member, so we invest the cash balance that the city holds in interest-bearing investments. They're not exciting. I don't know, I can't list them off the top of my head, but I'm sure Mr. Ruff can, and so I'll invite him up to join me. But I will say that what we can invest is limited by the state, and we're not out doing anything crazy, but I'll turn to Mr. Ruff.
Welcome, Mr. Ruff.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, city invests in, as Micah mentioned, boring, low risk, statutorily mandated investments. Those include treasuries, include what are called agencies, which are essentially pooled mortgages that are indirectly guaranteed by the federal government and rated AAA. We invest in bank CDs, either under 250,000, which we don't have, I don't think right now, any, or collateralized, meaning that a bank has to set aside enough security to satisfy state law. The reason we've seen this bump is the same reason that when you buy a CD, if you choose to do that, that where before you were earning like 0.25%, now with the Federal Reserve raising short-term interest rates, the cash that we have, especially our operating cash, which tends to go up and down with the receipts of our property tax revenues and state aids a couple of times a year, has now gone from that like 0.25 or 1 or 0.5% to over 2%. I think the point is that's good for maybe a year, but if we're concerned about recessionary influences that might drop interest rates in the future, that we will be going back down to that 0.5%. And so that's the risk we take in this variability, and that we don't have any guarantees. We also invest very short, meaning that our investments typically have a duration of less than 3 years, and some cases a few months. And so that's, again, part of the variability. But those are the types of investments that we have. If that answers your question.
And the treasury bonds, then, that involves the federal government?
It does.
And are they investing our money somewhere else when they're selling us a bond or whatever it is? What's our money doing? Do we know?
Well,
Same with the bank CDs. Does that CD stand for contract for deed?
no, it stands for Certificate of Deposit.
Okay, certificate. So what's the bank doing with our money as we're holding a certificate of theirs? And which banks are we doing this with?
Sure. Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, I think if we want to get into a deeper level of conversation, it might be a longer conversation about what we do or we don't do with the money. But to answer your question about the federal government, I think we all know that the federal government is running a deficit right now, and so what they do with the money is to fund their deficit, and so that's my understanding of it. And the same with a bank, that it is whatever they turn around and lend with. I think based on the response to the staff direction that you had, I think, authored a couple of years ago, and that pursuant to our discussions, we have greatly diversified the places that we invest money. We had previously only been working with 4 investment advisors, which were primarily large banks. And so the promise that we as a finance department made to you as a council was to start working with smaller banks. So we did a request for proposals. We are now working with places like Merchants Bank and Bremer Bank, which were not previously involved in our short-term investments. We are also working with more local brokers and not just with large banks. And so I think our objective, based on council direction, was to create that diversity so that we were not just investing in large banks. And I think the goal that our staff has internally is to make sure that less than half of our operating cash is with larger institutions, and smaller amounts would be with smaller institutions. We would certainly welcome any other suggestions. It's a hope. I know the mayor has suggested in his recommended budget $500,000 of funding for Village Trust Cooperative, which is a city potentially going to become a credit union, which then we could turn around and buy CDs for that kind of organization as well. I was also disappointed that a number of local banks did not respond to our RFP. And so we did not reject any local banks off of the RFP. We accepted them if they were qualified to meet the state standards. And so that was something else that we will continue to do work with, is building those relationships with local institutions. We are not an easy place to do business with. We require insurance. We require, other levels of cooperation and standards that they don't see with other private entities or with other local governments. And so that's my suspicion. And we did do some follow-up with those banks as well. So it's got to be a two-way street from that standpoint as well.
Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the detail and the work that we've done to try to diversify that. I think partly what I'm getting at is responsible investments. I think the public is expecting us not necessarily to be investing in the military-industrial complex at the federal level, or investments that are going overseas, or fossil fuel investments through some of these banks and all of those. So that's kind of where my question is getting at, and I don't think we are necessarily, although I'm still not sure about these treasury bonds and what they're doing with their deficit, but I appreciate the detail. Maybe we can dig into it more in a future meeting.
Thank you, Councilmember. I do want to point out, we did have a very long presentation and conversation about this exact topic. I feel like it was a couple of years ago, and I've just asked my staff to please find that, and I will certainly make that available and send it out to all council members for people who want to dig into this and have a little bit more information about it. If after that there's more discussion that is wanted, then I think that can just take place offline.
Good.
Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe we also authorized finance staff to invest a part of these funds into naturally occurring affordable housing as kind of like a win-win situation, where we would be able to use that method to invest our reserves funds, but also meet a city goal of preserving affordable housing. And I don't think that has been utilized yet, but we did now just hire the housing stability specialist that the council had approved in last year's budget. So I believe that person is tasked with trying to really bring to fruition all of these funds that we've made available for the preservation of affordable housing in the market.
Mr. Ruff.
Madam Chair, Council President, thank you for raising that. You were exactly right. And to invest, so agencies are pooled mortgages, and we work directly with Freddie Mac pursuant to council direction to invest directly in a single mortgage that would be a naturally occurring affordable housing. It would still be guaranteed by the federal government, but it requires both more work on part of Freddie Mac and our staff. But we can only undertake that investment when we are successful in supporting an organization to buy that property. We've come close a couple of times. We've actually worked right up to the giving quotes on interest rates, but they have not been the lowest, or I should say the highest bidder on a piece of property, they being those who would use that program. But that's another example of trying to target our investments, as Councilmember Gordon was mentioning.
So then we also received some transfers into the general fund on a recurring basis. So the largest portion here, 85% of those transfers in, come from the Downtown Assets Fund. So this is the financial location where we collect our local option taxes, our sales taxes and entertainment taxes. And then we do transfer from that Downtown Assets Fund a portion to the general fund. So about $20 million in entertainment tax each year, and about $10 million of our local option sales tax gets transferred to the general fund. The sales tax specifically is used for capital improvements and economic development, and that's a requirement of state law. The entertainment tax has more flexibility, and so that's a general fund revenue, just like many others. In addition, we transfer $7 million from the parking fund, excuse me, $7 million from the parking fund to the general fund, also to support general fund activities. When I mentioned that our parking citation revenue is down, one way that we have helped support that loss of revenue is an increase in transfer from the parking fund. So we assume a 2% growth per year on the transfer in from downtown assets, and that's just our assumption for how our sales tax will grow over time, so that as a percentage of total sales tax, we'll be keeping that constant, transfer constant. And then from the parking fund, we assume that unless directed by council and or the mayor, that we'll maintain that transfer at $7 million annually.
Thank you. We have a question or comment from Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was hoping we could actually go back to the last slide first. And I apologize if I missed this explanation, but we're seeing about a $3 million decrease. Is that what you were speaking of with the automatic being able to pay via app? I was just curious as to why we were seeing that $3 million cut. And then additionally for the transfers in, for that significant increase, if I'm hearing you correctly, one of the reasons why is because of the downtown assets. And is that also because the Target Center sales tax now is going directly to the downtown assets? Or I'm just curious as to why we're seeing such a large jump there.
Madam Chair, Council Member, great questions. So you're asking questions about this category for 2018 as compared to 2019, just for folks who may be watching at home, and those numbers aren't included here on the slide. So there's a $3 million decrease in revenue in that other miscellaneous revenue category from 2018 to 2019, and that represents the one-time revenue we received in 2018 as part of the agreement with the Super Bowl host committee. And so we had budgeted that in this line, and so that's why it doesn't show up in future years. It was a one-time deal. In terms of the transfers in, the large increase from 18 to 19 that you're seeing is also one-time, and that's a lot of the, it represents the one-time spending that we had talked about with respect to affordable housing and some of the other one-time items that are included in the mayor's recommended budget that we had talked about at length a few weeks ago. So those were, again, one-time transfers in, and so they don't show up. The ones that are on the slide are the portion that are really sort of are ongoing anticipated transfers.
If I may ask a follow-up. So thank you for that. And so where are we seeing that change in policy from the Target sales tax going directly to the downtown assets? Where would we see that reflected in the budget?
So, Madam Chair, Council Member, you would see a change in the revenues as they're shown in the Downtown Assets Fund and the Arena Special Revenue Fund financial plans that are just a few pages after this five-year financial direction.
I think I more meant like on this sheet. Yes.
Yep. Madam Chair and Council Member, that because those revenues are being collected outside of the general fund, you wouldn't see them on this sheet because this is speaking directly to the general fund.
Got it. Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So that's a relatively quick overview of the sources that go into our general fund and how we expect those to change over the next 5 years. At this point, I'll note, I should have said at the beginning, another reason that it's important for us to consider our 5-year financial direction is that others are very interested in the fact that we do have a 5-year financial direction. So when we're thinking about the city's creditworthiness and bond rating, S&P has said to us specifically, the fact that you have a 5-year financial direction helps give us confidence in that AAA rating. So it's just another, talking about these things can feel like eating your vegetables, and so hopefully that helps make it a little bit more palatable. So on the uses side then, in our base costs, this is when we talk about our current service level, this is how the finance department projects that the current service level costs will increase over the next 5 years. And so the assumptions built into that growth are 3% on personnel and fixed expense. And I'll just underscore the use of the term personnel there as opposed to salaries. So this is inclusive of our fringe benefits as well, including health insurance, which, though we have good experience this year, has been a major cost driver in past years. And then, so overall for personnel and our fixed expenses, we expect a 3% cost growth each year. And in terms of our internal services, the IT and fleet and rent, those types of services, we're expecting a 4% increase. And the reason for a little bit higher expectation there is because many of these things, particularly when you're thinking about IT and fleet, are driven by outside cost inflators. So the price of software goes up, the price of vehicles goes up, and so that's included here as well. And then we also, in our uses, plan for our contingency requirement in the general fund. So we're required to carry 1% of expenditures as a rainy day fund. That's separate from the 17% of the general fund that we hold in unobligated cash reserve to make our payments day to day. So, and the other ongoing commitments include some other transfers out that the city has committed. So one example is $325,000 a year gets transferred from the general fund to solid waste to help pay for some of the graffiti remediation work that they do. Rather than duplicating work both from general fund sources and solid waste, everything's done by the solid waste team in Public Works, and we just support that with general fund dollars. And so with those, the reason I say assumptions vary here is that with those different components, there's a little bit different expectation. But if you have questions, I can certainly get you more detail.
Sorry, going to pause for a question from Councilmember Cano? Or, nope, no questions. Sorry.
So then, thank you. We have a few other miscellaneous uses. So we spoke last time about the omnibus pensions bill, which increased the city's contribution for para for police and fire. So the first year of that increase is for 2019. The coming budget year will have another increase in 2020. The Parks and Streets Plan, this represents the, when that plan was put together, there was a financial plan that accompanied it, and so this is the planned amount from the general fund that will be supporting that Parks and Streets infrastructure work. And then the last three lines there are future investments that the mayor is recommending we plan for in coming years. So though we're only budgeting for 2019, he's saying that his intention for 2020, 2021, out through 23 is to add some additional investments. I think with public safety, this is continuing a plan to increase the strength of the sworn police force. With the body cameras, this relates to the plan to make sure that all frontline officers or all officers, excuse me, are outfitted with body cameras, and these are the ongoing costs associated with that. And then with the future investment in elections, this is a plan that was started last year to ensure that there is a sufficient budget for our elections activity.
If I can just stop you there, Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I had another minute, I would probably answer my own question, but are these additional in each year, or are they reflecting ongoing? So is the $750,000 just like showing up each year because it's an ongoing expense, or is that an additional on top of itself each year?
Madam Chair and Council President, that is a very good question. And when I was reviewing my slides, I was looking at this slide and I thought, you know, one of these things is not like the others. So in the case of the Parks and Streets capital line, those are the one-year investments each year. The other dollars that you see are ongoing investments that will be made starting in that budget year. So using the additional para contribution beginning in 2020, we'll have an additional ongoing cost of $909,000 each year, and so that will be added into the base cost line. So goes the plan. And then with the Parks and Streets capital, you would read this as saying that the plan is for in 2020 to spend 4.9 million versus 2021. The plan is to spend 11.3.
I just have one more clarifying question about that, which was specific to to that line. So this is because we've phased in the Parks and Streets funding, particularly shifting in that year to more moving away from cash and other sources that were more readily available. But also, could you remind us the assumptions about NCR and neighborhood organization funding that are reflected here?
Madam Chair, Council President, your question is a good one, and actually, if I may, I've got a slide a little bit later where I'd plan to discuss that, but this does all relate to the Consolidated TIF District and when that comes offline, so you're right on track.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to get some clarification around two things. So it says around the future investments, public safety. I was curious as to how that was defined. And additionally, in the section about the police special revenue, it says that fund that money from that can only be used towards public safety. And so I was just curious how public safety is being defined in the budget in this context.
Madam Chair and Council Member, I'm a little bit hesitant to speak for the mayor in this context. I think that's probably a better question for him in terms of what his intentions are around that additional public safety investment. I think I'm safe in saying that this was part of the 5-year financial direction that was adopted in the 2018 budget, and he wanted to continue that placeholder for additional investments in public safety. What they are, I don't know specifically. To the question about the police special revenue fund, I will need to get back to you on the exact definition of public safety in terms of what that can be spent on. You bet.
Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just want to make sure I understand so these are additions to the budget that are then ongoing. So if we're talking about $750,000, then in 2021, it's 1.5 million more than 2019. And by 2023, we're projecting that our public safety spending would be 3 million more than the 2019 level. Is that correct?
Yep. Madam Chair and Councilmember Fletcher, that's absolutely correct in every case except the Parks and Streets capital line.
Right.
In that Parks and Streets capital line, those are just 1 year, one-time amounts.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll also note that there's additional spending for Parks and Streets capital beyond these amounts. This is just the general fund commitment, planned general fund commitment. So in terms of the property tax levies, then in the bottom third of the 5-year financial direction, the assumptions behind each levy increase are different, and that's simply because the nature of the spending and the cost drivers for each levy are a little bit different, and the drivers influence the assumption. So in the general fund, the assumption is that, and this is really based on our assumed level of spending for the general fund, so what the assumption is around the current service level and any additional future investments, as well as what the assumptions are with respect to those other general revenues. And so if, for instance, you were to assume an increase to a particular fee, then that would in turn reduce the assumption for how much the property tax levy would go up. And so again, from a policy standpoint, something to think about is where do we want to go with our revenue mix at the city, and what sort of assumptions do we want around the property tax levy change from year to year. The park board, our assumption that's included in the 5-year financial direction is a 4% annual increase. And at this point, I need to reference last presentation. I think I may have indicated that the park board had agreed through the Parks and Streets plan that 4% was what they would need annually for an increase in their operating levy, and the two are actually separate. So through the Parks and Streets deal, there wasn't an agreement on the increase to the levy. 4% is simply what they had informed us their assumption around their need would be moving forward. If they were to let us know that they thought they needed more than 4% moving forward, then that would be a discussion between the park board and the council in terms of what it is that the council wants to include. So the bond redemption levy then varies based on how much construction we're doing, and the Parks and Streets plan does play into our assumption here. In terms of pensions, you're seeing an increase of about $1 million each year, leading to a $2 million increase in 2023, and that's driven by the state legislature and the level that they're intending to fund the closed pension funds versus what their expectation is that we fund. The Board of Estimate and Taxation and the MBC, those are both defined by those independent boards' needs, much like the Park Board. TRA, the Teachers Retirement Association, is fixed based on statute, and then our assumptions around the library, debt levy, and the new public service building are, we assume that level, the needed property tax levy for those items is fixed, and that'll be based on the debt schedule associated with the debts that we have incurred and will incur. And so finally, we get to the property tax levy forecast, and at the bottom two lines of this chart show not only what the projected levy is, but then the increase from the prior year. So the 5-year financial direction as proposed includes an assumption that in 2020, the property tax increase would be 6.05% in order to maintain current service levels. 2021, 7.36%. So now is when we get to the Council President's question about NCR and neighborhoods. So in that 2021 budget year is when the consolidated TIF district, which funds the neighborhood organizations in the NCR department, that consolidated TIF district comes offline. And so that's about $14 million of revenue annually. This plan assumes $7 million will go towards the Parks and Streets, and you saw that right here in this line, the change from 2020 to 2021. That $7 million increase then drives the property tax levy, needed property tax levy increase to 7.36, absent any reductions in spending or other revenues that come in. The 5-year financial direction does not, at this point in time, include any assumption around funding of either the NCR department or the neighborhood organizations themselves. So if if council and the mayor want to include that and sub in the general fund levy for what's currently being collected through TIF, then it would be another approximately 2% on the on that levy, so around 9%. I think there are a lot of policy questions for you to grapple with. Again, this would be the financial implications of those is reflected here. And so it's important to note that with the consolidated TIF district going offline, and we talk about the absolute percentage increase for property taxes, but then we also talk about a feels like factor. So if there's less property tax being collected for the TIF district and more property tax being collected in the general fund, then the feels like factor could be 0 if those two are equal. And so I think it'll just be important for the city to communicate with residents that what exactly is going on here and how less is being collected in one, I hate to use the term pot, but in one pot of money and more in another pot, and how that impacts the property tax statement itself. I don't know if at this point Mr. Ruff has anything to add. I'm seeing nothing. Or if there are additional questions.
Council President Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is maybe a bit of a non sequitur, but related. I just wanted to highlight for several of my colleagues or the council that my office has started to dig into an issue that Councilmember Goodman has been talking about for several years, which is that the methodology that our assessor's office is using to assess the taxable value of rental properties is likely increasing property taxes significantly on rental properties in neighborhoods where we're trying to stabilize housing. And that's because we're using building sale as the driver of how we're assessing the value of buildings. And at the same time, we are trying to go on in the back end and use our 4D program and our financial tools that we have available to us to purchase properties, to help finance the purchase of properties, to give tax breaks through the 4D program in order to stabilize housing. And we may be limited by state law in how we can work on this issue, but I just think it's important to highlight that rental properties pay a higher tax rate in every classification of housing in our city. And because of this way that we're assessing the value of properties, rental properties are seeing very significant increases in taxes. I'm not sure the solutions are quite that simple. I know at the state level, there have been past efforts to try to relieve the burden on renters of this dynamic, but that hasn't necessarily translated into benefiting the renters directly. So I've been talking with the assessor's office and finance and others, and I invite anyone who wants to get more involved in this to dig in, because I think as we look at these pretty significant levy increases, it's important to understand how they're impacting the more than 50% of the people in our city who are renting their homes.
Madam Chair and Council President, I'm not sure I heard a question, but good point nonetheless, and it gives me an opportunity to once again remind folks about the state's renter tax credit, as well as the property tax credit for folks who do own their homes. And I don't have the website listed on these slides, but if anybody's watching, or for council members in their discussion with constituents, just simply Googling Minnesota property tax credit or renter credit will get you there. So all of the five-year financial direction discussion we've had relates to the general fund and the activities in the general fund. We also, in that section E of the budget book, have a number of financial plans related to our special revenue funds and internal service funds, as well as our enterprise or utility funds. I just wanted to include one slide here that shows what the proposed or anticipated increase will be each year for utility rates. It's between 3.7 and 4.2%, which represents really inflationary costs that we're seeing. And I think that in their discussion in the coming weeks, Public Works has some information about utility rates as well. So I'd encourage you to ask them questions if you have specific ones about what the new spending will go to beyond those just merely inflationary pressures. But did want to include this information for you here, as sometimes we certainly think a lot about the general fund and property taxes as well. We should; those are important, but there are also other pieces of the city's budget, and utilities are a large one. So that's the end of my prepared presentation. If anybody has any additional questions, happy to answer those.
Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you. I just had a little question about curiosity about the property tax levy slide, I guess. I know that there's also a housing levy that the Public Housing Authority can propose, and the council has to approve. It doesn't appear on this slide. would the practice be to treat that more like a school board levy or a county levy, as it's all separate? Or the fact that it doesn't appear, does that mean that they haven't been requesting one and it's not projected and they're not thinking of that?
Madam Chair and Council Member, that's a good question. To my knowledge, we've not had a direct request for a levy at this point in time, and so it hasn't been included in the 5-year financial direction.
But if there was one and one planned, it would appear more like the park board on our sheet here.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Colleagues, I want to let you know that I have been able to locate both of those conversations about how we've incorporated some of our existing money into different programs, both the affordable housing one and then also our diversification of banking. And I'll be sending those out to the budget committee, well, to all council members. There are some really useful presentations in there that have a lot of information in them for those that are interested. With that, and since we do have a quorum of council members here, I'd like to make a motion to receive and file this Part 2 budget overview concerning the long-range projections. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. That carries. That completes our business for today. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.